So welcome back to Foresight Paradigm. I am here with the author Andrew Curran, the author of Diderot and the Art of Thinking Freely. Here. Hi, Mr. Curran. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on. Diderot is a intellectual hero of mine, and as I was just telling you, I wish there were like politicians that I could get behind and were as inspiring as Diderot is. Fortunately, it's tough to find those. Um, but
Well, skepticism might be the first step toward truth, but I think sometimes that we just have to kind of make an intelligent choice given the choices that are out there, and I'll leave it at that.
right. And I do have my Diderot shirt on here. Uh, yeah,
Excellent,
so I'm a
excellent.
pretty big fan, and your book was great. Uh, Very well written and really nice illustrations. Great package. Um, so, Mr. Curran, let's start with the Radical Enlightenment. And kind of, Diderot was kind of, you know, a key figure there, maybe the key figure of the Radical Enlightenment. And the Radical Enlightenment is really kind of the where we get most of our, institutions and values in the Western world and maybe beyond, such as, democracy, secularism, full church-state separation, racial and sexual equality, um, eradicating religion from the legislative process and education. So, if you could speak to me a little bit about the Radical Enlightenment and why it's important, just
Yeah,
building on that.
I think it's important to think about, some of the, as you said, the legacy of the Radical Enlightenment. And you talked about the fact that the kind of foundations for American democracy and democracy in the Western world come from a certain group of people who were very much persecuted during the 18th century. And among the things that you were alluding to, there is kind of the empirical understanding of the universe, the fact that we need to not look to invisible friends or spiritual causality as a means of explaining our lives, our morality, for example. For a long time, for ages, for centuries, before the 18th century, revealed religion was the source for pretty much the understanding of life in all aspects. Life was regimented by sacraments. Everything was calculated to kind of bring people towards eternal salvation. And so there's this kind of gigantic death wish that's happening during the 18th century for people who are super religious, because life itself was this time where you prove yourself, and death is the final release, and then you can actually leave all your corporeal and spiritual pain and move on to kind of a higher plane of existence. And there is a group of people that you were alluding to. We were kind of chatting before the podcast, Delbach, Helvetius, Diderot, and a number of other people who found this to be, and this was going on in the 17th century as well, Hobbes and Spinoza as well. There are a group of people on a large scale who start talking about changing the way the world should operate. And they did so by attacking the kind of epistemological foundations for spiritual causality and the belief systems that kind of propped up the Ancien Régime, monarchies, and so on and so forth, right? So it really was a kind of a whole-scale rejection of a number of kind of what we now call kind of conservative ideas. And if you get rid of God as the kind of a priori, the first thing you think about before you evaluate the rest of your life, it is incredibly freeing in many ways. And so this is what these people were saying. If you can just leave this idea that there is this gigantic world of spiritual causality and providentialism and move forward in life, and kind of make decisions based on the physical givens and the physical data. And that's what really was going on with the Radical Enlightenment. And in terms of the legacy today, I think that people have downplayed the Radical Enlightenment, although we have people writing about it, the Jonathan Israels of the world.
I have a lot of his books.
I bet you do. He takes up a lot of pages, a lot of space on the bookshelf.
They're
He's
big.
so prolific. And I think what's interesting about the Radical Enlightenment is that it's it's not palatable for many people, in fact. So the ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment are generally kind of, we don't talk too much about Diderot and D'Holbach, even though they did all the heavy lifting in the 18th century. We'd rather talk about someone like Thomas Jefferson, or people used to talk about Jefferson in this way, as being kind of a deist, not being an atheist. They preferred to kind of keep some idea of God along with some of the other more empirical ideas. And I think that the atheists certainly have been incredibly important for who we are today, where our institutions are today, but they certainly haven't gotten the credit in textbooks, for example. I don't know where you're living. Where you
I'm in the U.S., Tennessee.
You're in Tennessee.
Yeah.
So, but for
Which
example,
actually is more, it's more liberal than you think.
oh yeah,
Especially in cities. It's kind of a country city dichotomy that kind of plays out
yes,
almost everywhere. So
everywhere in the United States is true. But textbook companies that work in Texas, for example, would never give the radical members of the Radical Enlightenment, quote unquote, their due. They'd much rather kind of look at these Enlightenment ideas as kind of somewhat tepid or just already existing to begin with. So the story of the Enlightenment is not an often told story in the United States. It's much more understood in Europe, where people are coming from monarchies and from kind of unified Christian traditions. The French and the Spanish get the Enlightenment much more because they can kind of see the trappings of these institutions on a daily basis.
yeah, I spoke with Philip Blohm a few weeks ago. I had a podcast with him,
Oh, nice.
author of A Wicked Company, and he made the point, in Europe we know what the Enlightenment is, but I told him, here I can go to a bookstore and ask for books on the Enlightenment, and they take me to a Buddhist section,
Absolutely.
and it's pretty
Yeah.
sad, especially given how important it is for our, like look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights. That appeals to our common humanity in a secular way that everybody can get behind, and not religious dogma, and all the things you mentioned also, our secular democratic ideals and constitutions. Um, so definitely, and that is very, very sad. We need more documentaries. We need more movies. We need movies about Diderot and documentaries and others, that really do. And Jefferson, I'm a fan of his. When I went to the Washington, D.C. to his Jefferson Memorial, I spent hours there because it's just covered in great, Enlightenment quotes from him. But, but yeah, he was a deist, and he, or at least it sure seems like in all his letters, he must have kept it really private if he was an atheist, But yeah, definitely. And we hear people that talk about, I couldn't imagine being an atheist before Darwin, but yet we had all these atheists that were, of great relevance, that were very robust intellectuals, and they had evolutionary ideas. You go back to the Enlightenment, you have people like Buffon, who was a kind of an atheistic naturalist, and he had evolutionary ideas, and Lemaitre and Diderot. Uh, they all had evolutionary ideas. Even you go back to ancient Greece, and you can find kind of a evolutionary ideas, and naturalistic ideas, like even like Lucretius, who kind of you know helped with the Renaissance, rediscovering his work, of atoms and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's really interesting to think about how the Greeks and the Romans freed the kind of Enlightenment thinkers in a lot of ways because
yeah,
they
the
provided.
Ionians. The Ionians
They,
were big. Yeah.
that's right. So the pre-Socratics and then people like Lucretius, the great Roman poet, provided an entirely naturalistic model for the universe. And even if this was a very kind of poetic understanding of the universe, it was based on one of the primary beliefs of people like D'Holbach and Diderot, and that is monism, that there's not two levels in the world, there's one level, and we must kind of think about the world as being completely unified. Once you have a second level that's not subject to empirical scrutiny, then you can say anything, you can claim anything. And they believed, like Lucretius, D'Holbach and Diderot believed, very much like Lucretius, that religion was not a spiritual tool, it's a political tool to dominate people, because you can say anything you want, claim anything you want, and there's no way to refute it. And then those ideas become institutionalized and become political cudgels.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And let me talk about the evolutionary type thing, because I think it's so interesting and so important.
Okay, can I get? Well,
Sure.
we're gonna get into Diderot kind of like for the
Okay,
rest of
sure.
the way, and we can kind of branch off into that. I did want to mention though, like for me, and I wish other people there were more people like me. The reason I got into the Enlightenment is because I love history. If people took more interest in history, I think that'd be a good thing. And also, I'm against religion because I've studied it and for science and secularism and the tolerance that it gives a state and how it's just demonstrably better. Look at Scandinavia compared to you know every other the worst countries in the world are the most religious. I mean, pretty much across the board. So there was kind of for me an intersection of my interest in history and my support for science and secularism, and realizing that there was that tradition of great, really intellectual giants going back thousands of years to like ancient Greece. Um, and because the religious people they have their tradition and you can see it everywhere. It's always flaunted and everywhere. It's ubiquitous. But people that are secular, we have a tradition too, and it's very enriched. It enriches everything to discover that, and also because it's so important in the Enlightenment, how it's actually kind of the foundation for things that people like to give Christianity credit for. But Christianity, as you alluded to, it saw the world as fallen. It saw people as broken playthings, and
Mm.
it, it was all about the next life. Christianity gave us the divine right of kings. Um, it stifled and suffocated freedom of thought and progress of every kind. So it's the Enlightenment where we get so much of what makes the modern world superior to past times. So,
It's interesting how American 18th century history has been rewritten to make it um, to make sure we include some kind of theological component to it. But it's true that the 18th century kind of founding fathers, many of them were deists,
uh,
or Thomas
I
Paine, even more radical. So it's interesting to think back that they were profoundly influenced by the same kind of nexus of Enlightenment ideas that were circulating in Europe.
Absolutely. And Jefferson had in his library he had books of Dolbach and I believe Diderot also. So yeah, these there was a lot of cross pollination, and of course, like Franklin and Jefferson, they lived in Paris, and they, I think Jefferson knew Condorcet, and he knew Grimm, who was kind of the best friend of Diderot.
Mhm.
Uh, so all kinds of cross connection there. Um, but getting into Diderot more specifically, Mr. Curran, can you talk to me about his atheism and his evolutionary ideas and how he got them and what exactly he thought in that regard.
Yeah, so I think it's important. Diderot is like you, which is to say, he studied religion. He almost became a priest during his lifetime, and he dropped out of the University of Paris, which was, and the Faculty of Theology, which was the Sorbonne at the time, as a young man. And I think that he was exposed or contaminated, depending on your perspective, with or by the kind of humanistic slash secular slash materialistic type ideas, materialist ideas that were circulating in Paris in the 1740s. So you have
All
to
right.
imagine a very, very, very religious country, France in the 1740s, and Diderot had arrived there as a 13-year-old to study religion essentially. And I think that when he first started out, he didn't just go from believing in God to not believing in God. It was a progressive and very wrenching process where he slowly took scientific methodology and juxtaposed it with a series of metaphysical slash religious ideas. And the scientific methodology won out, and in a lot of different ways. The kind of creation myth, the examination of scripture, biblical exegesis, the kind of stuff that someone does on a very serious level. He's looking at the Bible, engaging with the Bible, thinking about the Bible, and just finding enormous inconsistencies. So he's definitely in the lineage of Hobbes and Spinoza in that respect, and some other 18th century thinkers who were rejecting the Bible. And one of the big questions at that time was also not only things like the question of evil, but what is the earth and who are we? And he, as he got away from this gigantic death machine that was Christianity at the time, he was very much engaged in the rehabilitation of pleasure. The idea that we're here on earth to do good, but also to feel good. And this is something that seems to be, which is really kind of quite, I mean, people have been talking about pleasure for a long time, but, pleasure and sexuality were really seen as really awful things by the church at the time. And so he's arguing for a kind of more humanistic type idea. And at the same time,
Not just at the time, pretty much through time.
right. And at the same time, he was also very interested in debunking the Christianity or the creation myth, and then the creationist type understanding of the universe, that the Earth was 5,700 years old or something like that. A very kind of literalist understanding of timescales. And to do so, he looks back to Lucretius and De Rem Natura, the amazing poetry of the universe, a kind of primordial soup type vision of things and monsters and creatures being born with two heads and some kind of natural selection taking place. Well, not really natural selection, but a triage of nature's freaks, etc., which gives us the illusion of order. And order, of course, was a justification for God. It's a teleological argument for God's existence. And by saying that the earth is the product of chance and mutation and accidents, Diderot is getting a lot of these ideas from Lucretius. He's putting forth an understanding of chaos and mutation and a kind of a natural understanding of the universe, which was, again, one of the things that gets him, or at least keeps him in prison in 1749 after he writes the letter on the blind. He said, essentially, we're all blind.
Yeah, the letter on the blind. He had Saunderson, the blind. I think he was a mathematician or something. He fabricated it, but he was the character, and he had him kind of refute the argument from design. And he had from what I read, he basically laid out natural selection, evolution by natural selection, pretty clearly. 100 years before Darwin.
Yeah, that's right. So he
Yeah,
is certainly taking those ideas from Lucretius and putting them into and combining them with some ideas from the 18th century having to do with
right.
polyps and other sorts of kind of proto-biological notions.
Some are Buffons. Come there, Buffon. How you say his name?
Yeah, so they're
Not
both. I mean,
positive.
This is both in the 1740s. So
Yeah,
Diderot and Buffon are writing at the same time. They're friends.
right.
And certainly Diderot is fascinated by La Métrie in particular, who's people who are thinking of the world as something that came out of chaos. It was a super heady idea at the time. If you think that everything is, controlled and ordered, and all of life is supposed to be part of this gigantic providential kind of plan, and thinking about the earth as chaos and morality as coming from nature as opposed to revealed religion, these were kind of big ideas at the time. It was not, I
Right.
mean, when it comes to evolution, it's important to kind of think about, Diderot and Lucretius and Delbach, the people who played with these ideas. They thought that things could mutate, and they thought that there was a kind of a triage and kind of a selection going on, certainly that left stronger beings. But at the same time, they didn't have any idea of adaptation, and it was a much more kind of a quick process as opposed to a slow, progressive shifting. Diderot says that the worm might turn into an elephant and the elephant into a worm, without kind of talking about the fact that these changes would take place over a long period of time. They had a very, very dynamic understanding of nature, which is
Yeah.
really interesting.
Well, if we fast forward to his D'Alembert's dream, he kind of predicts DNA. He talks about the kind of the mother and father having some type of like filament that combines, and that's why kids look different than their fathers and mothers. And he talks about how who knows what animals came before us, and what animals will be after us, in our
Yeah.
cosmically brief, you know, time scale things. That was a very interesting dialogue.
Yeah,
He talks
yeah,
about how the mind affects the body, and if you kind of elevate the temperature of the body, it affects the mind, things of that nature. So
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that D'Alembert's Dream is really, Diderot's most interesting book in a lot of ways. When,
yeah,
particularly when it comes to kind of where we are now. A lot of these very interesting kind of proto-biological ideas that are not based on empirical kind of notions, which is to say that Diderot was kind of leapfrogging his generation to kind of talk about things like cloning and kind of intervention on an embryological level in order to kind of change
yeah,
creatures and
right,
crossbreeding and the idea that nature was this gigantic place for experiment, which is what we're doing right now. I mean, the coronavirus vaccines are exactly that. It's intervention of nature, changing nature in order to kind of help humankind. So that's kind of what Diderot was talking about at the same time.
right,
But to do so, he does make people dream because he knows he can't put forward these ideas in kind of an empirical setting.
yeah,
The encyclopedia is not a place for something like this, nor would a kind of a
right.
proper scientific paper be the place
Well,
for this kind of stuff.
he had one article called Animal in the encyclopedia that
Hmm.
it kind of got at some of this, right? Um,
Yes.
yeah, so yeah,
Right.
definitely. And you mentioned the sexuality. It's one thing I liked about him is, he put erotic passion, how you say it, volupté,
Yep. Volupté.
um, yeah, is one of our highest passions, and he has an article on the Enlightenment called Enjoyment, and he talks about, you ignorant people that kind of malign pleasure, you exist because of pleasure,
Hmm.
you know, things
Yeah.
like that. So I definitely like that from him. Um, Getting into Diderot's morality and his politics, can you talk to me about that a little bit? I know his article "Natural Right" from the Encyclopedia, and I like it a lot. It talks about kind of, again, our common humanity and the general will, uh, and how that's kind of the basis of, you know, of our ethics and should be the basis of our politics.
Yeah. So again, morality is also an important thing in the 18th century, linked very much to the idea of religion or not. So Diderot was a great believer in natural morality. It's one of the areas of his thought that's kind of something of a contradiction in that he did not he didn't say that morality exists uh, you know, um, he believed in almost a kind of a metaphysical or transcendental type idea, and that is that humankind wants to do good because it feels good to do so. Now, this is kind of we might call this ethical naturalism or natural morality. At the same time, this has had no kind of empirical foundation, and but at the same time, he certainly believes that. And he takes himself as an example that we need to do good, and we can derive laws from the fact that we feel good by when we do good, and these are the ideas that form the basis of a social compact, a social contract. And we see this idea of universalism in
Right.
some of his kind of political writing, the idea that we're all part of this kind of big group of people,
And he
and
wrote kind of passionate tracts against slavery. He wrote the supplement to again, I don't know how you say his
Bougainville,
name. There you
like
go.
Bougainvillea,
I've never heard it pronounced.
right,
And also in the Reynal's
right.
history of the two Indies. Yeah. So yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, I've heard people say, because he's got the quote, enlightenment stops in the suburbs, but he seemed to be like Jonathan Israel puts him, at the head of the Democratic Republican radical movement. So I think he definitely harbored, great hopes that the common people could be enlightened at least eventually, even if not the people of his day. Uh,
Yeah, I think that that's right. So morality for him is very much linked to institutions and education. You
right,
inculcate these ideas, and you're drawing on the idea that people are going to feel good when they do good. So we see this in his suggestions for educational reform in Russia, and we see it in some of his other writings as well. He certainly believes in that. He's not the most radical when it comes to um, let's see, kind of democratic principles initially. I mean, certainly that prize goes to Rousseau, who is, although not associated with the radical Enlightenment in some ways, certainly in terms of democracy, is he's the person who
is
says,
it Rousseau's? democracy really problematic, though? I mean, it's pretty authoritarian.
So at
Uh,
the ultimate in the social contract, that's right. So
yeah,
there's an idea of a kind of almost like a Robespierre type person who kind of stands above the fray and embodies the general will. Diderot and
yeah,
Rousseau both believed in the general will, and probably in the 1740s, they were talking about these ideas. Diderot was editing Rousseau, and Rousseau's editing Diderot. At one point, I think Diderot said that he came up with the idea of the general will, if I'm not mistaken, and that becomes the foundation of one of the foundational ideas of Rousseau's understandings of political power, that the people embody and confer this power to some kind of sovereign. And Diderot was
right,
saying the same thing in Political Authority, that famous article I think you alluded to, that no man has by nature the right to govern others, or by God as
right,
well. So he's kind of
right,
pushing back against divine right. So yeah, Diderot, a lot of the ideas that Diderot is putting forward certainly are very powerful and speak to kind of democratic principles. At the same time, he was not advocating for an overthrow of the monarchy by any stretch of the imagination early on in his career. This said, toward the end of his career, I think he had kind of pretty much figured out that monarchs are in the business of monarchy because they are hungry for power. And he saw that with
yeah,
Catherine, and he was also disappointed by the French monarchy and the failure of the French state, the super powerful French state, the biggest country in Europe in the 18th century, to actually take care of its people. He
yeah,
understood that by the 1780s, or by the late 1770s, and so that's why he becomes much more kind of violent in his condemnation of political abuses in Reynal's The History of the Two Indies, that book that you referred
right,
to.
right. Excellent. So do you think that he contributed to the system of nature? Because I've heard that like the parts of that book by Dolbach that are very like poetic, and they talk about I don't remember, it's a very long book, but like, oh ye daughters of virtue and reason, the only true virtue. I can't remember how it goes, but those really look poetic flourishes are like his come from him. I've read some scholars that have said that. Do you agree with that?
I think it's probably true. There, having studied Diderot, this is my second book on him for a
Yeah,
long time. I do feel like that particularly some of the early portions where Dolbach is actually talking about kind of two layers of creation,
right.
and rejecting those. And there's this one layer. It sounded very much like Diderot to me, and I always thought that. And I gather that, I think that in some of the correspondence, there are moments where Diderot is kind of alluding to the fact that he's working with Dolbach. And
Right.
Dolbach's house on the Rue Royale was essentially an atheism factory. He was taking old texts and republishing them.
Right.
He was writing his own things and putting somebody else's name on it.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. It's
And the
and
System of Nature sold pretty big around Europe. It was kind of like a phenomenon.
enormous, enormous.
Yeah.
So you can. It's one of the books you can find at antiquarian book dealers pretty cheap,
Yeah.
because there were so many copies. Yeah, had a huge, huge
And
effect
again,
on
I
things.
believe Jefferson had that in his library, among
Yeah,
other people.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, no, it's very, very, very important. He had the Diderot's. He bought an encyclopedia too.
Yeah. And so many people don't know about all of this history when they talk about democracy and religion and atheism and where are the source of our modernity. You know, so
Yeah, so
that's a shame.
the Enlightenment has been retrofitted with religion. So one nation under God is an interesting thing, right? So
Yeah.
this is supposed to be a pretty secular nation, and has been retrofitted with these ideas, vows and the Bible and that kind of stuff. So there's
Yeah.
religion always comes back.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, I think we're far better than we've ever been. Way better than, the time of the Enlightenment. Definitely where people could still, be executed. I mean, that's why Dolbach had to publish his stuff, anonymously and had to or attribute it to dead friends and things like that,
Hmm.
which is pretty sad. And they smuggled books like people smuggle drugs now across the border back
Right,
into
right,
Holland,
right.
all that. So, kind of to wrap up, what do you think is your favorite work of Diderot?
Oh, it had to be Rameau's nephew, though.
Really?
Rameau's nephew is it's interesting because I think we see kind of the contradictions of the Enlightenment being staged by Diderot with
Was Rameau
himself.
kind of his version of Lametri, kind of the amoral atheist, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and even more cynical. I mean, La Mettrie wasn't. La Mettrie was a hardcore. In many ways, I think that's a good observation. You know, La Mettrie was a hardcore materialist, but who also went all the way when it came to notions of morality. And there is no such thing
Yeah.
as a kind of a good morality. It's whatever feels good is good for me, right? And that will become the point of departure for the Marquis de Sade, right? So how can
Right.
you say can you say that I can't cut people's heads off if or commit some kind of horrific sexual act? How can you say that's wrong? Because this is the way I am, and this is what gives me pleasure. Therefore, given natural morality, that should make sense. And so this is a kind of extreme argument of the Enlightenment, or an argument of the Enlightenment pushed to this absurd kind of point.
Right.
And I think that Diderot anticipated the Marquis de Sade very much in Rameau's nephew. First, it's very funny, and we have a Diderot, a kind of a tepid, the moderate Diderot, the kind of Diderot of the encyclopedia, who is not the kind of radical Enlightenment Diderot, the person who's kind of putting forward this Enlightenment project, the stodgy Diderot. And in many ways, his kind of subconscious, and that person is Rameau.
But he was
So
kind of
Diderot's kind of put himself.
subversively doing it, right? In the encyclopedia, like you had like references to, I think, what was it? The Eucharist had no cannibalism, and the reference was see Eucharist, things
Mhm.
like that. He's being pretty
Right.
subversive there.
He was indeed. He was
Yeah.
indeed. That same reference was in an earlier encyclopedia, but he was certainly kind of was a wag, and so that kind of sense of humor shows up much more in the person he's talking to in Rameau. He's
Right.
not very funny. He's like a straight man
Right.
for Rameau, and Rameau embodies this la maîtrise, ego-driven appetite, this morality which is based on his own pleasure. And he also talks about kind of the reality of living in the 18th century. If you don't have enough money, there's a kind of almost um, kind of a voice of the downtrodden there, which is it's a
Yeah.
very interesting dialogue that goes back and forth, and it allows us to kind of think about Diderot's entire career in a very different way. So that's my
Okay.
favorite, and I love D'Alembert's Dream too. I just think
Yeah.
that's really fun. So
Yeah.
those are my two. Those are my
Absolutely.
two.
A lot of funny bits in Dylan Bear's Dream too. Like
Yeah,
when the like dude is masturbating, and the lady, I can't remember her name, is like documenting it, and she kind of doesn't know what's going on exactly.
yeah,
It's kind of funny.
it is very
Um,
funny. Yeah.
yeah, I would say for me, I just read The Skeptic's Walk, which I had never read,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a great dialogue in there between like deists and atheists and Spinozist atheists,
Right.
and I really like that. But I think maybe my favorite is one called it's a short one that I think he wrote when he was going to or back from Catherine the Great on his trip there to Russia, called Conversation with a Christian Lady, or
Mm-hmm.
the Marechals. I don't remember.
Maréchal. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of bleeped out whatever her name is, I think, in the title.
yep.
But just because, I mean, it's very simple, but it's just very kind of charming. Like she says, "Oh, you're the guy that believes in nothing," and he's like, "Yes, in the
Right.
flesh, madam." It's kind of,
Right.
the style is very attractive, and he makes, great points in it. So, uh, well ahead of its time. So yeah, definitely. So we need more Diderots, and we need as Steven Pinker, has written the book Enlightenment Now. You know, we need more reason, science,
Mm-hmm.
humanism, and amen for progress. Absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mr.
Thanks so
Curran.
much. All
I
right.
look forward to your future work, and that Diderot and the Art of Thinking Freely is a great book. So,
Hey, thanks
uh,
so much.
thank you so much.
All right. Take care.